Welcome to Pleasurology Island. I'm Free Thought Steve. Thanks for stopping by. My purpose here is to help you learn how to be happier, particularly if you're someone who is leaving Christianity behind and is wanting to discover your own worldview and your own set of values, your own set of ethics, your own set of what's right and wrong, your own ideas about this. I've been going through this for over half a century, 60 years really, because I started out in 1965 as a 17-year-old son of an evangelical preacher, and who then decided I didn't believe anymore in the worldview that I had been raised in, and I wanted to figure out what I did believe in. And particularly, I wanted to figure out what was right and wrong, ethics. And I wanted to discover a different kind of ethics from the Christian morality. Christian morality is a theistic morality. And Christian morality consists of a bunch of moral dictates. That is, the biblical God supposedly dictates commands that all Christians are supposed to follow. And you grow up believing that those commands are contained in the book they call the Bible, and that you have to follow these commands, and you have to believe that God exists, and you have to believe that Jesus came and died for your sins, and he's your Savior. You have to invite him into your heart and live your life for Jesus and live your life for God, following all the moral dictates that God has put into the Bible. That's a theistic ethic. It's a God-centered ethic. And what I'm going to suggest to you is that there's a humanistic ethic instead of a theistic ethic. There are many humanistic ethics, I suppose. One of them is the ethics of pleasurology, or the ethics of hedonism, consistent, intelligent hedonism, where we try and win the game of life in the only moment that we can actually win the game of life, which is the present moment. And if we're enjoying the present moment and we're having a state of euphoric consciousness, then we're winning the game of life in this moment. And that's the only moment that we can win it, because all the other moments are already past, or they haven't gotten here yet. So the humanistic ethics of euphoria states that euphoric states of consciousness, where we have wonderful feelings, happy feelings, good feelings, pleasurable feelings, the kind of enjoyable states of consciousness that we want to continue to have and continue to remain in, these are the only ultimately good things in life. Everything else in life that we think is good because it contributes to us having euphoric states of consciousness. And it's the euphoric states of consciousness are the only things that are an end in themselves. When you get to a euphoric state of consciousness, that has value in and of itself, and you don't need to go beyond that. That's the ultimate value, is a euphoric state of consciousness. And conversely, the only ultimately bad thing is a dysphoric, an unpleasant feeling state of consciousness. So the goal of euphoric ethics is to spend as much of our life in a euphoric state of consciousness as we can, winning the game of life moment by moment as we go through life, by having euphoric states of consciousness as much of the time as possible. And that's the only good thing to do in life, is to create euphoric states of consciousness. But ethics is not about just our own personal consciousness. Ethics is about recognizing that we share the planet with 8 or 9 billion other consciousnesses of the human species alone. And so other consciousnesses can be euphoric or dysphoric, can feel good or bad, just the way that ours can, so that we're not egocentric. We don't think that our consciousness is the only one that counts. But in ethics, ethics is a way to have a community, to bond with other people by recognizing that their happiness is as important as our own happiness. So what's important in life is happiness and equality, equal happiness if possible for all of us. Because you being happy doesn't take anything away from me being happy. We can both be as happy as we want, and we're both generating euphoria in our own consciousness, and my euphoria isn't taking away from your euphoria. You can generate as much euphoria in your consciousness as you want, and I will still have just as much euphoria in my consciousness as I can create. Each of us can create as much euphoria as we're capable of doing in our own consciousness without having to take euphoria away from anyone else. So this is like a win-win situation. And so good things in life to do are creating euphoria for our own consciousness and creating euphoria, helping other people create euphoria in their consciousness as well. For instance, I think one of the best euphoria creating activities that human beings can engage in is a sandwich hug, where 3 people get together and one person's in the middle and one person hugs them from in front and another person hugs them from in back, and the person in the middle is sort of surrounded by human affection and warmth and contact, and everybody gets a chance to be in the middle because everybody has an equal right to happiness. So a sandwich hug is generating euphoria in the consciousness of all 3 people that are participating in the sandwich hug, and they're all just getting more and more euphoric and creating more and more euphoria for each other, and no one is taking any euphoria away from anyone else. That's one of the cool things about human affection and love. Nurturing affection, particularly when expressed physically with a hug or cuddling or a massage, clothes on group massage, is a wonderful way of nurturing affection. And everybody gets a chance to be massaged. So you've got 3 people. 2 people are massaging one person who's lying down, face down, and the other 2 people are massaging them. And then you take turns, and everybody gets a chance to do that. You got your clothes on, so it doesn't get messy with oil, and so it doesn't turn into, an orgy. It stays nurturing affection when that's what you're doing. Now, erotic massage is another thing, and it's wonderful. It also for generating euphoria, but it takes a little more bonding on the part of the people who are going to be involved there to get involved in an erotic massage. But, a clothes-on massage, where the person is just lying face down on the floor and the other 2 people are massaging them, is a wonderful way for each person in turn to receive nurturing affection. And what nurturing affection does is it activates our emotional brain. If this is your brain, here's the front of the brain, here's the back of the brain. This goes down to the spinal cord, down to the body. And then if you turn the brain around like this, you can see the red part here. That's the emotional brain. And so when we hug each other, when we give each other a sandwich hug or a massage, any kind of nurturing affection and touch that, both people are into. You can't do it. You shouldn't try to give someone nurturing affection if they don't want it, okay? Both people should be voluntarily, or all 3 people should be voluntarily agreeing to give each other nurturing affection And then when they do, the emotional brain that I just showed you will release all kinds of wonderful chemicals into our brain, dopamine, oxytocin, and endorphins particularly. And those chemicals diffuse throughout the brain, and they are what give us feelings of euphoria, emotional feelings of delight and pleasure and happiness. And so that's a humanistic thing. That's a human-centered ethics. We human beings decide for ourselves that we prefer to be happy rather than unhappy. We prefer to have euphoric states of consciousness rather than dysphoric states of consciousness. And so we do things for ourselves when we're by ourselves, like solo sex is a wonderful way to give ourselves euphoric feelings of pleasure. And when we're with other people, nurturing affection is a wonderful way to give each other wonderful feelings of euphoria and happiness, and win the game of life in that moment that you're doing it. And then you feel that glow afterwards because you've gotten those chemicals released in your system, and you feel that glow for quite a while, and you can remember that experience. Every time you remember that experience, your emotional brain will remember it with pleasure and give you a euphoric state of consciousness. And so, to my mind, that's one of the best ways that we can win the game of life, because you cannot win the game of life at the end of life. Some people think, oh, if I can achieve all of this stuff, if I can make a lot of money, if I can buy a lot of toys, if I can buy everything that I wanted, if I can have great, great experiences, at the end of my life, I will have won the game of life. At the end of our lives, our brain quits producing our consciousness evaporates, and we completely forget that we ever lived. We're completely unaware that we ever lived, and we're completely unaware of the fact that we're no longer living, and we are completely unaware of the fact that time is passing, because when the brain stops producing our consciousness, we lose our ability to register the passing of time. And so time ends when our consciousness dissolves at the end of our life. So the only time we're actually going to be spending is while we're alive and conscious. But as soon as we die, everything we've done, all our memories evaporate along with our consciousness. And nothing we've ever done matters anymore to us. Because at that point, we're totally released. We're released from time, and we're released from experience, and absolutely nothing happens to us for absolutely no time at all. In fact, we cannot experience being dead. It's impossible to experience being dead. When the brain stops producing consciousness, it's impossible for us to experience anything at all, including time. And so, death has no duration, and we cannot experience death. We're never going to experience being dead. Epicurus, the ancient pleasurological philosopher from ancient Greece, said, "What do I have to do with death? If I'm here, obviously death is not, because I'm alive. If death is here, I'm not, because my consciousness has already finished. So death and I are never going to meet. It's impossible for us to actually meet death. We will just have our consciousness come to an end, after which nothing happens to us." And I cannot tell you how hard it is to imagine how completely nothing death is. Because whenever we try to imagine the nothingness of death, we are imagining experiencing the nothingness of death. We're still imagining some kind of experience there, experience of that non-being. But that's not what death is. Death is the total absence of experience, including the absence of time. So we've all been through death. We've all been through death many, many times, and we have no memory of it. And I'm not talking about being reincarnated. I'm talking about during this human life, we've all been through death. That is, every night when we go to sleep, we go through a period of dreamless sleep. We're tired, we're thinking about stuff, we get sleepy, our eyes are closed, and then we start dreaming, right? No. Before we start dreaming, there's a period of maybe half an hour, maybe longer, where we're not dreaming anything and we're not conscious at all. Our brain has literally turned off the nerve circuits that create our field of consciousness and keep it going all the time. When those nerve circuits are not working, our field of consciousness isn't there. But we never remember that. We never remember that period of non-consciousness because we don't experience anything during that period of non-consciousness. There's nothing to remember. Without consciousness, we literally are not there. We are our consciousness. And when our consciousness is not there, we're not there. So we have nothing to remember. And then our brain starts up the consciousness circuits again, but we're not connected to the outside world yet. We're only connected to our own imagination. And so our own imagination starts producing these dreams that we experience. And dreaming is a very vivid form of consciousness. And it's just a form of consciousness that is completely isolated from the rest of the universe. It's just happening inside our own head. And then eventually we wake up and we remember a little bit of the dreams, some of the dreams, the most vivid parts, but then we start having our normal consciousness again. And so we never notice that period. In fact, it happens maybe 3 or 4 times a night, depending on how many sleep cycles we go through, this period of non-dreaming, non-conscious sleep, when consciousness is totally absent. We go through it maybe 4 times a night at least, but we never notice it because it's impossible to notice the fact that you don't have a consciousness, that your consciousness isn't there. Because you would need a consciousness to notice that the consciousness isn't there. But that would mean that the consciousness was there. But when the consciousness is not there at all, there's nothing for us to notice. There's no experience and there's nothing for us to notice. So ultimately, what that means is we're never going to notice being dead. You can't notice being dead, just like you can't notice being in dreamless sleep. I have the experience sometimes of lying in bed with my wife next to me. We're watching TV, and it's late, I'm tired, my eyes are tired. I say, I'm just going to close my eyes and just listen to the program. And it's somewhere near the beginning of an hour-long program, maybe 10 minutes into it. And so I'm listening to the dialogue, and I'm just listening and getting more and more relaxed. And then the next thing I know, I hear the theme song at the end of the program. And the program's over. But just a second ago, the program was only 10 minutes into the program, and I was listening to it. And now all of a sudden it's over. What happened to that 50 minutes? Where did that go? Well, I was in dreamless sleep. And so I did not experience time during that period because my consciousness wasn't there. I wasn't there. I didn't notice being in that state. The only thing I noticed was coming back to consciousness and hearing the theme music at the end of the show. But I didn't notice, and there was no time taken up for me subjectively. I experienced that whole 50 minutes, it was just gone. It was like this here merged directly into this over here. The beginning of the program merged directly into the end of the program. It was seamless. There was no blank space there when I was unconscious. No. Consciousness sort of dissipated when I fell asleep, and then it started up again, but there was no space in between. You have the same experience if you have an operation, and the anesthetist, you're sitting there talking with the anesthetist, he's got an intravenous thing going in your arm, and he's talking to you to get you more and more relaxed, and he's listening to your voice. He's telling you to talk to him about something so that he can gauge how conscious you are. He can gauge when you lose consciousness. And when you lose consciousness, then he knows he better not give you too much more anesthetic or he'll probably kill you. So, but you've lost consciousness. You've been sitting there talking to him and you've lost consciousness. And the next thing you know, you're waking up and the whole operation is over. And maybe it took an hour. When I had my tonsils taken out, I don't know how long it took. But there was no time at all between when I went under the anesthetic and when I woke up again. When you're completely not conscious and not dreaming, time doesn't exist. And you can't even notice it. I had no experience to remember or anything at all. Anytime I've been under anesthesia, a couple times. That's what death is like. Death is like you can't possibly notice being dead because you got no consciousness to notice it with. And so death lasts no time at all. Not at all. Even if it goes on forever, it lasts no time at all because we are our consciousness. And our consciousness does not persist after our brain stops producing our consciousness. Consciousness is not sitting there in limbo in space saying, man, I'm going to be stuck here for eternity, doing nothing, being nothing. It's all black and boring. And geez, I wish it would end, but it's never going to end. No, it's never going to start. Death is never going to start. Life ends, but nothing starts after that. And when life ends, our awareness, our memory, our identity, it's all proof like that. And so if you're watching this a few years from now and I'm dead, I won't remember having made this video at all. I won't remember talking to you at all. That will completely be gone. I won't remember having lived. I won't remember my wife. I won't remember anything I did in my entire life. So it won't make any difference to me at that point whether I had a euphoric life or a painful, suffering life. Once I'm dead, it's all the same. Everybody gets exactly the same score when we die. 0, okay? Nothing is left. So the idea that whoever dies with the most toys wins the game because you've had enough money to buy everything you wanted, that's bullshit. You don't win the game at the end of life, just game over. We win the game of life every moment that we live when we are enjoying ourselves and having euphoria. So life is about learning how to become more and more euphoric. And that's what I've really spent my life doing. Back in 1972, during the middle of the counterculture, I became acquainted with what I would call euphoria-producing activities. Muscular relaxation activities to make my body feel better. Relaxation activities to calm down my emotional brain. Zen meditation to quiet down the thoughts in my head and help me focus my attention. And eventually I learned how to do super euphoric sex. Once I had learned how to be really relaxed, then we can learn how to create sexual arousal and not have an orgasm immediately, but go into high arousal and stay basically in high arousal, coming up and down just below the orgasm threshold for as long as we want. And during those periods, we can allow sexual bliss to fill up our entire consciousness, flowing out throughout our entire brain. And then when we have an orgasm, the orgasm also flows out through the entire brain, wave after wave of orgasmic pleasure. And this kind of super euphoric sex is a really wonderful way of self-nurturing. It's a way of creating some of the most euphoric states of consciousness possible. And it's something that doesn't require taking anything away from anybody else. We can create as much sexual euphoria for ourselves as we want in solo sex, and that doesn't take away from anybody else's euphoria. Or we can create as much euphoria as we want in our partner sex, because super euphoric partner sex can go on for a long time, and the woman can have multiple orgasms if she's multiply orgasmic, and the guy can spend the whole time in high arousal sexual bliss and then finally finish off with what I call a cosmic orgasm, this full brain orgasm. And all we're doing is creating euphoria for each other. We're creating more euphoria for each other. So this is ethically a good thing. This is ethically one of the most desirable things we can possibly do. And that's the humanistic, sex-positive, realistic way of looking at life, is that the more euphoria we can create for ourselves and each other, the better off we'll all be. And if we can, at the same time, do things to help the whole planet do better, save the planet, and help people around the world be happier, if we can contribute to that somehow, that's even better, because then we feel good about ourselves. We feel like we're using our life in a positive way in order to help other people be happy, and that makes us happier. So the generation of happiness is something where we can all create more happiness for ourselves if that's what we choose to do. And a good way to start that is forming a tender nest. A tender nest is like 3 people, or multiples, or more, but a core of at least 3 people, because then you can give each other sandwich hugs, you can give each other 2-on-1 massage, nurturing affection massage, and you can have all kinds of good fun with each other in very helpful and euphoric ways, very safe ways, and that makes life worth living. Okay, euphoria is what makes life worth living. If we don't have euphoria in our lives, we're not winning the game of life. And of course, in the end, it won't matter. When we die, it won't matter. But while we're living, it matters. This is the time when it matters whether we are euphoric or dysphoric. And therefore, the best thing we can do in life is learn how to become more euphoric, because of a very important principle called the do-good, feel-good principle. It's a very important principle of ethics, actually, that actually it's the feel-good, do-good ethic. I may have said that the wrong way around. First, we feel good. And when we feel good, it is natural for us to be kind and friendly and helpful and affectionate to other people, and help them feel good too. So we feel good, and then we do good by acting in such a way that other people are made happier by our presence and by the nice things that we say and do with them. And then because we have made them feel happy, they like us more. They feel more affectionate toward us, and so they want to help us be happier too. So once again, it's a win-win situation. But we human beings have to realize that's what we want to do. Now, the biggest problem that we have in doing this. We have several problems. First of all, we've got to decide that this is what we do want to do. We want to dedicate our lives to creating euphoria for ourselves and for the people around us and for the whole planet. We want to make the whole planet happier while we're alive in this life, which is the real life. This is the real life, the only life. So, first we have to decide that euphoria is what we want to do, learning how to create euphoria. But then we have to learn how to create euphoria within our own body and our own emotional brain. And there's a problem with that. There's a problem that we have in creating euphoria, which is that as we've grown up, we have gotten more and more tense because life has put a lot of pressure and stress on us. And if we've been in a religious environment, that's particularly true. And particularly if we've been in a religious environment that has been that has been commanding us to deny the satisfaction of our own sex drive, our biological innate sex drive, which is one of the strongest drives in our body, and which is the source of our most pleasurable and euphoric experiences of sexual pleasure and orgasm. And yet, Christianity, unfortunately, is a sex-negative religion, and it insists that people deny themselves sexual pleasure until they are married, and then they can only have that sexual pleasure with their partner. And it denies us the opportunity to satisfy our own sex drives through solo sex. They say that's bad, and they say any kind of sex with someone of your own gender is bad. Any kind of sex, if you're not married to the person, is bad. There's all kinds of bad sex, and there's only a very, very small window of approvable sex. And that's because they are following moral dictates. They're not following rules that they themselves have figured out with their own minds and decided upon, like the humanistic ethic that I've been talking to you about, the euphoric ethic. That's the ethic that makes sense to me as a human being using my own intelligence. But the Christians are not using their own intelligence to decide what's right and wrong. They are allowing the Bible to dictate to them what is right and wrong, particularly in the realm of sex. Now, sex is a natural biological drive that's built into all of us. It's built into every organism on the planet that reproduces by sex. It's a sex drive. It's the drive to experience sexual pleasure and orgasm to satisfy our sex drive, because throughout evolution, that's how people pass their genes on to the next generation. And no species would survive if it didn't have a very strong sex drive. So it's absolutely crazy for Christianity to come along and pit itself against the sex drive and say the holiest people are those who don't have any sex at all. But if you must have sex, well, you can only have sex within marriage. You can only have sex in order to have children. That's the only kind of sex that God approves of, the biblical God approves of. They are allowing the biblical God to dictate their sexual decisions to them, and they enforce those same sexual decisions on their children. And so we have been subjected to these sex-negative dictates of the biblical God. All right, what's the biblical God? The biblical God is an imaginary being constructed by people who lived thousands of years ago in an entirely different type of society, a pre-technological society, basically a pre-scientific society. They didn't know anything about anything. You know, they knew absolutely nothing. And yet they made up these rules, which they imagined were rules that the creator of the universe was giving them. And people who with good imaginations can imagine that the universe is talking to them personally And they can believe that they've heard what the universe had to say, and they can write it down and say, okay, this is what the universe says. This is an oracle of Yahweh, basically, is what you find in the Bible over and over again. You can say where a prophet says, okay, this is an oracle of Yahweh. I got this message from Yahweh, and now I'm passing it on to you. It's like the Delphic oracle, where the priestess supposedly got a message from Apollo and passed it on to the people who were asking questions. Well, the prophets of the Bible were getting an oracle supposedly from the imaginary being Yahweh and passing it on, and people were writing it down, and these rules that they wrote down became the dictates of the Christian religion. First the Jewish religion, then the Christian religion. Now, all of those dictates that purport to come from the biblical God, Yahweh, are false truth claims. The whole Bible is made up of false truth claims. They are claiming something is true, but that is a false claim. How can I say that it's false? Because no one can talk to Yahweh and actually fact check whether this is what Yahweh wants or not. In fact, no one can fact check whether Yahweh exists or not, because Yahweh is supposed to be a non-physical spiritual entity that supposedly has intelligence and magic powers, but no one's ever seen it, because you cannot see or detect a non-physical entity with any scientific instrument or with our senses. There's no way to know anything about a supposed non-physical being. It's a product of the human imagination. And it being a purely imaginary product, it can be whatever the person who imagines it wants it to be. But somebody else can imagine it differently. And both of them are wrong, because nobody can know anything about so-called spiritual beings with non-physical, supposedly non-physical existences, because you can't prove they're there. You've got no evidence about them. You can't observe them. I am a complete, committed agnostic when it comes to non-physical entities of any sort. There is no way any of us knows anything about non-physical entities. We don't know that any non-physical entities even exist. If they did exist, we wouldn't know anything about what they were like, because the only way we can know something is by observing it. You know, if you want to know whether it's raining outside or not, you got to look outside or go outside and find out for yourself. Or you can find out on the internet, but you at least have somebody who's observing whether it's raining or not. And that's evidence. You can know whether it's wet or not when you go outside. But you can't do that with non-physical beings, supposedly non-physical beings. They exist only in human consciousness. And every human consciousness can imagine any kind of non-physical being that they want. And none of those imaginings have any truth validity to them, because you can't check them. You can't observe the entity that you're imagining. So anybody can imagine anything they want about that imaginary entity, and no one can prove it true or false. So we should not base any of our decisions on somebody's imaginings about imaginary beings. And that includes everything that the Bible says is a sin. You see, a sin has a very specific meaning. Sin means something that Yahweh doesn't like, that the God of the Bible doesn't like, or whatever, the God of whatever religion you happen to believe in, or that your family believes in. Sin means something that the God doesn't like. But we can't know anything about the God. We can't know that the God even exists. We can't know if it's a god or a goddess. We can't know whether it disapproves of us having sex or approves of us having sex. I think it's more logical that if there were such beings, they would approve of us having as much euphoric sex as we want to have, as long as we're intelligent enough to prevent any negative consequences, either at the time or afterwards, like pregnancy or STDs or heartbreak. If we can avoid those things and just give ourselves pure sexual euphoria, then I would think that any creator beings would actually approve of that. They would say, oh, that's a darn good way to use this pleasure system that you happen to have in your body and nervous system and consciousness. So to say that anything is a sin is a totally bogus concept, because no one can prove that any imaginary non-physical being likes or doesn't like any particular activity. There's no such thing as a sin. That's an invalid concept, because no one can fact check whether some imaginary supernatural being likes or dislikes any particular activity. So sin is not a valid ethical concept. What is valid is a concept of causing pain to other people, and that's something, or causing pain to ourselves, causing distress and dysphoria. Any act that does that is an ethically undesirable act. We cannot always avoid doing something like that, but we should try to avoid it as much as possible. We should try to not do things that upset other people or seriously annoy them. We should not do anything that violates someone else's rights. And this is another really important aspect of ethics. Happiness, equality of happiness, equality of consciousness, and rights, personal individual rights. Everybody's got, all right, rights are not a thing that exists in the world. A right is an agreement that we have among ourselves, because if I want to have this right, then I need to allow you that right as well, because we're equal human beings with an equal right to happiness. So if I have the right to not have you hit my body or hurt my body or injure me in any way physically, and if I have the right to not be emotionally abused by you, if you happen to be able to get me in your power for some reason, if I have the right to not be sexually abused by you, I have the right. These are just agreements. We say, okay, I wouldn't want that to happen to me, so I will agree that I won't do it to you, and you won't do it to, you'll agree not to do it to me, and that's what we call a right. That we have the right to express ourselves freely, to talk freely, to say what it is on our mind. Freedom of speech, in other words. Freedom to think for ourselves. And that's something that religions are not that comfortable with. They don't want people thinking for themselves. They want people thinking the way the religion wants them to think. They want people to think the way the religion dictates that they should think. It's an authoritarian system from the top down, And the people at the top are using the Bible to dictate to other people what they should think and what they should believe. But the Bible was written by people who died thousands of years ago. So all they're doing is they're letting people who died thousands of years ago dictate to the rest of us how we should live our lives today. When those people died, before there were automobiles, planes, electricity, anything, birth control, medicine, so religious people are letting people who've been dead for thousands of years tell them how to live their lives. And they are forcing that on their children too. And I say children have a right to be protected against that. Children have a right to not be taught that something is wrong only because it's in a book that was written thousands of years ago by people who are long, long dead, who were imagining some imaginary supernatural being that they never saw or talked to. We have the right not only to express our own ideas freely, we have the right to not have other people fill our head with bullshit ideas, with false ideas and false truth claims based on imaginary supernatural beings, particularly when we're children and we're not old enough to understand that not everything adults tell us is true. You see, when children are that young that they can't distinguish, between truth and falsehood, truth and imagination, and the adults are getting them to believe that a bunch of imaginary stuff is true, that's a violation of that child's right to grow up without being scared by imaginary ideas like hell. Okay? This is intellectual child abuse. It's emotional child abuse, scaring a child with imaginary ideas like hell that are, again, they exist nowhere but in the minds of people who died thousands of years ago. So adults are religious adults are systematically violating the rights of their children when they grow up, when they teach their children as they grow up to believe in all this imaginary stuff. So people like that are the enemies of their children's happiness and freedom. All right? They may love their children and they may be dictating this imaginary bullshit to them out of love, but nevertheless, they are the enemies of their children's happiness and freedom and ability to think for themselves. Because once we grow up, if we've had our head programmed with all this bullshit, it's a lot of work to get it unprogrammed, and to unprogram our emotions is even harder than changing our ideas. And that's a lot of what relaxation and pleasurology are about, is learning how to free our emotions from these bogus ideas that have been imposed upon us, have been dictated to us when we were too young to even realize that we could resist that. So the one thing that we've got to do, the first thing we've got to do in order to achieve sanity in life is simply to stop believing that the imaginary is real. Stop believing that the imaginary is real. Only the real is real. Only that which we actually can observe and gather evidence about and experience for ourselves is real. But all of this other stuff, and even if you have like internal emotional experiences when you're thinking about God and stuff like that, that doesn't tell us anything about God. All that tells us is that your emotional brain has been so programmed that when you imagine that you're talking to God, your emotional brain feels nurtured and safe and protected and loved, which is a good thing, of course, but it's not a good thing when you think you're getting that from an imaginary being. It's much better if you can get that from a real human being, if we can get real nurturing and love from a human being, and if those human beings who are giving us the nurturing love and so forth do not insist on controlling our lives and telling us what we can and cannot do, how we can and cannot satisfy our natural biological sex drive, for instance. It's not appropriate for people, no matter what kind of powerful emotional experiences they have inside their own consciousness, to use those experiences which they have given to themselves by a form of self-hypnosis, by believing that they're actually talking to these imaginary supernatural beings and they've given themselves powerful emotional feelings, It's their own brain and their own imagination that have created those powerful experiences. It says nothing at all about any actually existing supernatural beings. So the first thing we've got to do to regain sanity and be in touch with reality is to stop believing that the imaginary is real. The imaginary is imaginary. If they can't show it to you, if you can't touch it, if you can't smell it, if you can't detect it, if you can't feel it, it's just imaginary. If it's only written in a book and nowhere else, it's imaginary. And you're letting your life be run by the imaginations of people who've been dead for thousands of years. And that's your choice if you want to do that. But I think it's crazy. Okay, thanks for listening. Talk to you again real soon.